Lands. You know them, you love them, and you can't cast this giant dinosaur without them. Going to the other side of the coin that was the single action economy, resources in a card game are a make or break type of system. Without them, you are constantly on edge of crazy busted combos, and with them, you might be playing something at a snail's pace for the next 2.5 hours. The goal of a resource system is to ramp up a game into being crazy, instead of having everything happen all at the start. For those who might be unfamiliar, resource cards are things like lands, energy, stones, red light districts, etc. The basic idea is they're a unique type of card in a deck that allows you to play all of your other cards. Generally, they don't do anything on their own except to be able to play your other cards. Now this might not always be the case, but the core concept is resource equal pay cost, and that's it. Generally, you might get to put one of them into play each turn, incrementing your total resources available by 1, just so long as you have them in hand to play. Starting with turn 1, you get 1 resource, and you can now play cards that have the play cost of 1. This is the system that people try to innovate or reconstruct when coming up with their own designs. Richard Garfield came up with this system when he was creating Magic the Gathering. He wanted to create cards in a system that people either loved or hated, and boy did he hit the mark. It does seem to be working. Plenty of people try to use or riff on the land system, which goes to show as it's the system with the most amount of research and documentation on. There are entire books and articles on how to properly play and use this system in Magic correctly. It's clearly left its mark on the TCG space. So, what are the positive things a resource in your deck can do for your game? Well, it can create an inherent variance without relying on any specific design. Having some amount of randomness before a game can even start is a good way to have a large amount of different outcomes. This also means you could remove some of the predeterministic outcomes of a match before it starts. It creates a slower ramp into the action, so players have more time to get set up or get going. It means the game will end up lasting longer in theory, and player decisions will matter more in the long run. It acts like a safety valve to how wild or fast a game can end up being. It can also allow for expression in deck building. Having different colors means people can customize and create their deck in their own way. Being able to lock or enforce blank cards to a resource and then further to what those resources produce mean you can really fine-tune what you're doing in your deck, which is a fairly large hook for people who want to be expressive, and depending on implementation, it means decks and archetypes you wouldn't expect can pop up out of nowhere. There are quite a few pros to having a resource in your deck, but it doesn't mean they're perfect. I'll cover the cons of the system a little bit later. So what's changed since Magic the Gathering started using lands back in the 90s? Well, about 1,000 new card games have come out, and tabletop gaming in general is almost entirely different. But the resource in a card game remains constant, either using it one-to-one or by trying to change the system in various ways. From moving the card to another deck, making them part of cards that are already in your deck, making all cards lands, or removing them entirely and just making a number go up each turn. Let's take a look at a couple of the ways it has mutated. All cards are resources. This was one of the first unique mutations from the system, and I think the most popular. Starting with Duel Masters and then being put into other games like Spoils, WoW Trading Card Game, and like a million others at this point. You remove the land as a type of card and tack it onto all the cards in your deck instead. When you would normally go to play a land, you'd instead play a card from your hand, usually upside down, to denote it being a resource. Sometimes the system may also have you place it face down instead of face up. What this means is none of the cards in your deck are not doing anything anymore. Anything and everything is a card you can use. The only dead draws are the normal ones a TCG will have. No flood or screw here. I'll explain what those mean in a moment. However, some games have explored this concept a little more than others. The WoW TCG added a resource card back into the deck called Quests. These would go into your resource area and would have you pay some amount of cost to get their effect. These were basically like lands from Magic the Gathering, but they had effects on the land themselves. In WoW's case, these were one-time use. You'd flip them back down and they were just a normal resource again. Spoils TCG did something a little different as well. In this game, you could also run resource cards in your deck, but they weren't required. And as a game action, you could pay 2 resources to draw a card, or 3 resources to play an extra resource in that turn. This was actually huge for the game. It meant that all factions had access to card draw and ramp, as well as allowing you to recover from multiple situations. No more screw, and you could draw past the flood if any. This was probably the best version of the Duel Masters all-is land resource in my opinion. Lands in a separate deck. Some games may opt to still have the lands, but remove them from your main deck. The most common version of this is what Force of Will did with their stone deck. This was a separate pile of at least 10 stones that you could pull the card from each turn. One of the original versions of this was from the Legend of the Five Rings trading card game, but it also had your creatures in that same deck. You had one deck for creatures and lands, and the other was for spells, instants, and other cards. The land you would get in L5R actually had a cost associated with it, so you'd have to buy them with other resources, then they would provide you with more resources. So you were buying up resources to then buy resources to then buy more dudes. This created an interesting cost to resource scale ratio for your resources in your deck. You also did always have a card in play that would allow you to produce some amount of resources to start paying for stuff. This version lets you have a creative aspect of the resource system while still also adding some amount of variance to it. It means you didn't have to lower the card quality in hand while also having resource cards. Argent Saga also had this resource deck, however in their case all cards in that deck were the same. It was just a way to track the incremental resource system. This is the digital version of the land system, and one that was popularized by Hearthstone. It's pretty straightforward. You start with one resource, and you gain one max resource at the start of each turn. Not many physical games have done this, as it's kind of annoying to manage and track on paper. Both Nostalgics, Argent Saga, and Shadowverse Evolved have tried this kind of resource system. Argent Saga had a deck that was a pile of stones that you'd put into play one at a time. They were all the same color, so the order never mattered. Nostalgics and Shadowverse has you use two different dice or tracking measures, one to track the maximum and then the other to track how much you've used for that turn. None of these systems had any faction or color requirement in the cost you'd play. Everything was generic because it was always a single number going up each turn, kind of like in Hearthstone. It meant you never had to worry about your color or faction restrictions in deck building, you just always had the resource accessible every turn. Honestly, this is the most boring version, but I think it's the safest way to do incremental resources. There are likely other smaller changes to the land system, but these three are the most commonly used and widely recognizable. And now for the proverbial 3/3 white elephant you've been gifted in the room, the downside of the land system. Taking the system as is from Magic the Gathering gives you the following problems to solve. Non-games. This is the biggest issue. If you never draw your resources, or only draw your resources, you cannot play the game. This is commonly referred to as flooding or screw. Flooding being too much, screw being not enough. This is different than playing poorly or suboptimally. This is straight up, 0 cards can be played. You have almost no control over this, and it's the lowest low of the in-deck resource system. Try all you like, but if you have a resource card in your deck, this is something you'll have to be aware of. High variance. This is a con, but also a little bit of a pro. Some games may like actually having the variance of this, and having these resources in your deck is the best way to do it in a positive or negative direction. When you have cards that do nothing, the average power of a card in your hand is lower than in a non-resource game. This means the amount of stuff you can do versus the amount of stuff your opponent can do will vary depending on the draw of resources and the cards that you can play from those resources. Slow. Sometimes games can be excruciating to play when both players are both flooded or screwed on resources. Not playing cards for 3 to 4 turns, just waiting for something to happen. This is that flood and screw again. Flood, you've drawn too many resources. Screw, you didn't draw any resources. Just by the nature of limiting the amount of cards you can play to turn by the cost of the cards, you slow the game down when compared to other systems. They aren't fun. This one's a bit contentious, but the reality is that playing cards with the sole intent of only being allowed to play the game isn't fun. Very few people like having to run or play lands in their deck for this reason. Extra cost. Most of the time, if you have an in-deck resource system, the resources are going to be an added tax onto how much a deck costs. Just look at something like Modern, Legacy, or other formats in Magic. Half or more of the cost is just the lands themselves. There is a lot to consider when looking at the resource system. Having resources in the deck also means you'll likely need a lot more cards in your deck to have both enough resources and cards to actually play. There's a reason most games with them have a 50 to 60 plus deck size, which just plays back into the variance of it. This means you'll have to account for some kind of bloat, and you'll have to do a lot of math for your deck sizes and how many resources and how high you want people to play on curve and... Something else to note, and this is just mainly for any game with a resource system, not just lands, is that when you have a resource system, once you start making cards cheaper that are similar to other cards, you can't go backwards. For example, if you have a 2-cost creature with 2 power and 2 health, once you pick a 1-cost creature with the same stats, people will never pay for the 2-cost creature again unless you give them another card that benefits that exact card. Then once you start taking into account the effects on the creatures, you can start spiraling. This is one reason why resource-based games tend to rotate their card pools, but that's a subject for another video. Lands have a large emotional impact to a lot of people. Because of the variance of the system, you'll remember the highs and the lows much more than a resourceless or tweaked resource system. This is what causes a lot of the discourse around the core system and why so many people want to tweak it. From games where you lose to drawing none or all of your lands, to games where you draw the perfect resource at the exact moment you needed to. Realistically, you could just drag the system as is and drop it into your game, and it would probably function. However, the current narrative in the TCG scene is that lands are bad and you shouldn't have them. So while it may function fine, and you get to pull a lot of resources on how to perfect them, the general audience will react negatively to it. The common response to lands for people outside of the Magic sphere is generally disdain or some amount of complete abhorrence. But in reality, a resource system provides a lot to the pace and interaction of a game. It can create a lot of meaningful points and decisions throughout the duration of an entire match. Now, whether or not those decisions feel meaningful to some is another question. So when you want your overall game system to have a slower progression into the action, starting small and building up, that's when you want to use a resource system. But which would you want to choose between each of the variations? In deck, no change. This one's definitely for the people who are Magic inclined. There's really not much reason to go this route nowadays, unless you're trying to really strike the nostalgia factor, or reuse the design sensibilities of Magic's past 30 years. Make sure the best lands aren't always the hardest to get. Being able to fix your resources is a must, but it can't be too easy. Study how Magic did it, it's the best reference point, just copy what they did if you want it. In deck, all cards. This is the most common one and the easiest to add to a system. The only downside to this one right now is fatigue. A lot of games are going down this route, and some people may find it overly generic or even overdone. But just tack a color onto a card somewhere, add it to your rule set, and not much changes. Balance around having to put cards into your resources. Be careful with multicolor, it is a trap in this system. Keep the cost curve of your game slightly higher than you might think. Consider the spoils extra mechanics. Outside of deck. Less common nowadays, but it used to be around a lot more. This is really the best middle ground between wanting lands but not wanting Screw and Flood. Honestly, it's my preferred version of the resource system, not super played out and gives you a second deck to potentially work off in card design. Multicolor typing is a pain point for the system, be sure there's fixing. Ramping with a single deck is very powerful, be careful with it. You could mix and match the resource deck with other cards in this kind of system as well. Incremental number. This one's the most boring in my opinion. It's safe, it works, best in digital, still offers some ramp up gameplay, but it really means you need to design around always letting people use up all their resources in a single turn. You can't really have multicolor in the system cleanly, it means you have to figure out a solution for how to lock someone from playing all the best cards in a single deck. Lands and Magic are both widely loved and hated. It's the longest lasting resource system behind Pokemon's energies. Lands serve a very important function in both how it works and how people connect with it. The expression it allows with the different colors means you can really allow people to start showing themselves off in this system. But it doesn't mean it's perfect, gated behind cost, availability, and sometimes pure randomness. Resources do have a function and a purpose in a game system, and it's important to recognize and apply that to your own games. If you want something that is a slow progression into action, where single turns are a little less important than the overall game, and where OTKs are a little less likely, then this kind of resource system might be for you, or you could just go full Yu-Gi-Oh! Until next time, see you!